Welcome to the Patrick Page Podcast. This is your host, Michael Littig. I'm here with my dear friend, Patrick Page, and this is our first episode ever. So Patrick wanted to start with a quote. So off to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Michael. This is a quote that people know, at least a part of, I think, but it's by Goethe. And since we are beginning something new today, and I have a feeling a lot of people are beginning new things right now. This is March 28th, 2020. So most of us are sheltering at home. We're practicing social distancing. And a lot of people are thinking about their lives, thinking about how they might begin different projects. Well, we're beginning this podcast today. And so here's the quote. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness concerning all acts of initiative and creation. There is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance, which no man could have dreamed would have come his way. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. That's the end of the quote. So that's what we're doing today. We're beginning something. We don't know where it's going to go. But when you take that first step, then you get all kinds of assistance from people you don't know yet. And so that's going to be our podcast. It's not going to be all heavy like Goethe.
There'll be a lot of Goethe, perhaps, but
it'll be fun. It's not going to be all heavy. Don't worry. If you made it through that first part, you're going to make it through anything. But I thought, Michael, what we might do today is just help people to understand why we're talking to each other at all. This podcast was really your idea, so why don't you start?
Yeah, so I think it's always good to start at the beginning. I was reminded of, when you were talking about Goethe, I was reminded of that T.S. Eliot quote, what we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And, for us, as we make this bold step, I think it's good for us to, before we begin to frame who we are, I think it's good to go back to when we met each other.
Yeah.
This was 2006.
So was it 2006?
Yeah, almost 15 years ago. And I think it's helpful to frame where my mindset was. And what's cool about this for the listener, Patrick and I haven't really talked about this from our own point of view. And so I'm really excited, a little bit vulnerable, a little bit scared to hear both sides of what it meant to meet each other. Patrick, for the listener, Patrick is what I would call my mentor, one of my best friends. He is like a father figure to me. He is truly one of my guides. When I moved to New York in 2005, he became one of the most important people in my life. So I think I'll start there.
Well, that makes me feel good.
Well, it's going to be interesting. I think I'm going to start in a way, I don't think you'll know where I'm going to start, which I think will be kind of interesting. So the hope of this episode, friends, is to chronicle 15 years of our lives together, and how we've intersected, collided, and influenced each other, or I can certainly say how Patrick's influenced me.
And to give, sorry to interrupt you, Mike.
Oh yeah, please.
Just to give the listener a heads up, our plan then is to move forward into future episodes where we'll deal with some of the things that we hope that the listeners are interested in. We didn't really introduce ourselves. I guess we're assuming that some people know what we do. I'm an actor. I was currently playing Hades in Hadestown on Broadway, and Michael and I also run an acting studio in New York City. And so the podcast will deal with a lot of that. I also have a lifelong passion, is not really strong enough a word. I can't think of the right word. Obsession, passion for the works of William Shakespeare. So we will do a lot of in-depth stuff about Shakespeare, but also about musicals. I was in perhaps the most famous or infamous musical of all time, Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. We'll definitely be talking about that. We'll be talking about Hadestown. We'll be talking about television work as well and how it differs from stage work. We'll be talking about acting techniques, since Michael and I are acting teachers. But in order for you to appreciate any of that, I think the best way is for us to start with who we are, how we met, and then go from there. So we'll start there today. I think there's a lot of fun stuff.
Yeah, so similar to Patrick, I'm also an actor. I'm a theater artist. I'm a resident company member with Theater Me Too, which is an international theater company based in Brooklyn. I'm also an entrepreneur where I've co-founded now four businesses. The most recent one being the Zuckerberg Institute, which deals a lot with innovation both in the theatrical landscape. I'm an investor, a producer on Broadway, and also I am a very proud teacher. I love to teach. I've taught at NYU. I've taught both in high schools across the country and workshops around the world, teaching theater to students in countries like Egypt, Mexico, Japan, India, and so on and so forth. There's a lot to talk about amongst those things. And you'll start to hear how the questions we talk about as actors and the questions we talk about in Shakespeare, because Patrick and I both share that deep passion for, has shaped a life that is truly the road less traveled. If you're familiar with that Robert Frost poem, that two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the road less traveled, and that has made all the difference. And it is partly, I would say, for me, asking big questions as an artist and asking the questions that we do in our studio, the Patrick Page Studio, that has really guided me on that. But I'll start at the beginning. So 2004, so this is 2 years before I met Patrick, I was at the Public Theater Shakespeare Lab. So this is a program that was developed by George Wolfe many years ago. It doesn't exist anymore. And we had a guest teacher, and his name was Roger Rees. And this will be interesting because Roger Rees comes back into Patrick and I's life together many years later, which is a full circle moment for me. But Roger Rees came in and he taught Shakespeare sonnets to us. And he told a very simple story where he said, when I was started at the Royal Shakespeare Company, I started by watching shows from the back of the audience, and I played spirit carriers. And my friend Ben Kingsley and I started that way, and we both left playing Hamlet. And that in itself was such a huge foundation for me to hear. I had, like Patrick, I know you feel the same way. Like I had literally rented out this is back in the day, friends, when you would rent out the John Barton Shakespeare tapes from the library. You couldn't get it anywhere else.
There was this thing called videotape in the day. And there used to be stores where you would go and rent these videotapes, and there were big machines that you had in your home that you would put them in. And anyway, you got these tapes.
I got these tapes, and I saw the work of Judi Dench and Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart and so many David Suchet, so many amazing actors. Roger Rees was one of them. And so when Roger said that to me, I was about to graduate college and come to New York for my first time moving to New York City. And I started by working at Shakespeare Theater, New Jersey. And immediately I knew instinctively that I needed a mentor, or I needed a guide to guide me through these plays, which were so fundamental to the apprenticeship of acting in Shakespeare. So I come to New York. I instinctively know I need a mentor because at that time, I had really become drawn to certain artists. I had worked at that time with Anne Bogart from the City Company, an amazing director named Andre Gregory. And I saw the work of Peter Brook and all these are amazing theater artists that when they were in their 20s, they ultimately went across cultures, and that defined who they were as artists. And I felt this call to do that. So here's all these questions that are racking in my brain, and I'm working as an actor in New York City, and I'm a reader. So one of my first jobs in New York City.
You're going to have to tell the listener what a reader is.
Oh, so a reader is someone who works. So when an actor auditions at a casting office, there's a reader that sits opposite the actor on the side of the table with the casting director and the director and the producer. And I have been a reader now.
And the reader, just to clarify, the reader is going to read the opposite part to the person coming in. In other words, if you're coming in to audition for Hamlet, then the reader, whether it's a man or a woman, might play Ophelia in that scene, then might play King Claudius in another scene, might play Queen Gertrude in another scene. The reader is all the other parts opposite the person who's auditioning.
Exactly. And so one of my first major projects at that time was The Grinch That Stole Christmas.
But it wasn't Hamlet. It was The
Grinch. And I was the reader. So Jack O'Brien was the director. So folks that know Jack O'Brien, one of the most important theater directors of the 20th century, sitting literally next to me. And I was a young 22-year-old kid. And in walks in this man who sang a song from Scar because he was from Lion King. Yes, you sang. Really? Yeah. You said I played this 8 times a week, but I thought it was really apropos for that character.
Oh, I know. I remember it differently. That's funny. I believe your memory better than mine. I thought I sang the song. I thought I sang "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch." But
you did at the second audition, the callback.
Oh, okay. So
this is the first audition.
First one I sang "Be Prepared."
Okay. So you sang "Be Prepared," and then you read the scenes. And I had never, and I'm not blowing smoke up your ass right now, but I had never seen an actor be so in command of language and was simply responsive. And I go, oh my God, who's this person? And then on a break, I sneaked over behind the table and I looked at your resume and it said Hamlet, Iago, the Scottish play. I won't say it out loud.
You can say it out loud. We're not in a theater. Although we don't want to tempt the virus.
Exactly. And all the leading roles in Shakespeare. And I said, that's the person. And you don't know this. Okay. But you don't know this, that literally that afternoon, I had a big audition for my first Broadway show that I ever auditioned for. And it was for the Caine Mutiny Court Martial.
Mm.
And because of the way you acted in that scene, I was so confident and calm. And I walked into that audition and I got a final callback from that audition because of our interaction.
You mean just in terms of reading the scene that you'd internalized something about how to walk into a room?
Yes, 100%.
Oh, that's cool.
Isn't that crazy?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so Patrick ends up getting called back for the Grinch. I end up getting called back to the Caine Mutiny Court Martial. And I was friends with Stuart Howard, who was the casting director, who was a dear friend. And I told him, I said, I saw this actor named Patrick Page. Do you know who Patrick Page is? And he was like, of course I do. And if anyone who knows who Stuart Howard is, he was like a character. And I was like, can I get in contact with him? And I was like, I'm going to write him a letter at the stage door. So I wrote you a letter at the stage door and I dropped it off. I just dropped off a letter at the stage door.
Of Lion King at the time.
Yes,
is that
correct.
Right? Yeah.
And I said, dear Patrick, I was your reader for The Grinch. I don't know if you know who I am or if you'll remember me, but if you coach actors or coach Shakespeare, I would do anything. I will pay you anything to learn from you. Signed, Michael. This is my email and my phone number.
Okay, now I have to make you pause and jump, and I have to jump in, and then I want you to pick up.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so that's super cool about Caine Mutiny Court Martial. I did not know that. I want to put in my brain that I want to tell our listeners later on. I think we're going to do an episode. Maybe we'll do it actually the very next time about the audition process, because I've done so many auditions, you've done so many auditions, and I don't know how many you must have over the years sat in on when you were working in casting offices. Thousands, no doubt.
Thousands, for sure.
So Michael's expertise on that side of the table and mine on the other side of the table. Plus, I've also been a director and vetted actors for my studio. So I think that'll be useful, and we'll do that next time. But it's interesting that I have a different memory of that. I didn't remember that I sang Be Prepared, but of course I was in Lion King at the time. And I just want to bring the listener up to date, which is that I'd been in Lion King for quite a long time. And I had finally gotten something in my contract that said I could audition for other roles. And Grinch was the first role that I had auditioned for where I was in Lion King, and they had agreed to give me time off if I were to book it. And it would be, if I had booked it, which I did, fast forward, end of story, because people know that, it was the very first role I created on Broadway. Up to that time, I had always replaced people. So I had replaced Gary Beach in Beauty and the Beast. I had replaced John Vickery in The Lion King, and so on. I stood by for Roger Daltrey in A Christmas Carol. But Grinch really was the first time I'd originated a role from the ground up. Anyway, please continue with your story.
Well, then, so I basically, if I was in final callbacks between me and another person for the Caine Mutiny Court Martial, and I told myself, if I don't get this, I'm going to email Andre Gregory. So if anyone who knows Andre Gregory is, he's really famous director, actor. He did a film called My Dinner with Andre, where he sits with Wally Shawn for a long time and talks about these adventures he's gone on. And he also did Vanya on 42nd Street, which was a beautiful film.
If you haven't seen My Dinner with Andre and you're trapped in your room because of the virus, it'll be the best 2 hours you ever spent.
100%.
You're going to love it.
So I when I was, 21 years old, I had dinners with Andre, and he would mentor me about the world and like questions about.
I did not know.
Is that crazy? Yeah,
you were the Wally Shawn.
I was the Wally. So I emailed Andre, and I was like, where should I go? And he said, oh, you should go work with Eugenio Barba. Eugenio Barba, for people knows as European theater director, or go work with the Work Center of Jerzy Grotowski and Thomas Richards in Italy. So fast forward, I did not get the Caine Mutiny Court Martial. And so I told myself, I'm going to go to Italy. And I went to Italy, and I basically just showed up. They picked me up at a bar in Tuscany, and they drove me out into the Tuscany countryside. And I saw a piece that they had worked on with Jerzy Grotowski. So Jerzy Grotowski was one of the most important theater directors of the 20th century. He really changed theater in the 1960s in a big way.
Absolutely.
And so I saw a piece that they'd worked on daily for 12 years, and it was called Action. And it changed my life. It was a piece that was rigorous, seemed like it was all made up on the spot, but in fact, it was so detailed. It was everything I thought acting could be. And I stayed to talk with them, and I learned about that Grotowski had mentored these two young men, Mario Biagini and Thomas Richards. Thomas Richards was Lloyd Richards' son. Lloyd Richards, a famous theater director, one of the first African-American theater directors on Broadway, directed most of August Wilson's work. And so I came back from that moment, and in that time I was in Italy, I got an email from Patrick Page, and he said, "Hey, I'm so sorry it's taken me a while to get back to you. I ended up getting the Grinch," which you did, of course, you just said that. "But I would love to coach with you." And in that time, I had just got offered my first season at Utah Shakespeare Festival.
Utah Shakespeare Festival. That will
Yeah,
be part of our conversation.
that's a huge part of our conversation. And so we set a time to meet. And this is going to be important for the listener. I want to hear you talk about this, Patrick. It was April 20th was when we set our time to meet.
Oh my goodness.
So
I have
I'll
to
pause. Let's pause.
You pause there. We'll come back to this many times. I was about to use a cover phrase to say I am not a superstitious person. However, I am a person who believes deeply in the mystery of things and deeply in the reality of an invisible world which we are only very which we have very little knowledge of or contact with. It's, call it science, call it mysticism, call it whatever you like. For some reason, that week, beginning about April 20th through the end of April, is a magical time for me every year. It is in that period of days that virtually every major change in my life has happened. It's the most peculiar thing. And I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a theologian. I don't know how to explain it. I can only tell you what the facts are. And the fact is that Michael's been a very important part of my life. And when you tell me that we first met on April 20th, it kind of blows me away. I was born, incidentally, on April 27th. My guide in life, William Shakespeare, was born on April 23rd. And we'll tell you many more things that have happened around that time as we continue with our podcast. But Michael, go on with your story.
Yeah, so we met. I came to your apartment, and I told you, this is, and I want to hear it from your point of view in a moment. I told you, I basically sat down with you and I said, I'm interested in a long-term relationship. I'm not interested in one-offs. I'm interested in, I quoted all these actors that I just spoke to you about, Roger Rees and Ben Kingsley and Ian McKellen. And I said, I want to know what it means to play Hamlet. I want to know what it means to play Iago. I want to know what it means to play Romeo.
I remember that very well because I coach people frequently, or I did in those days. I've had to cut back on private coaching a little bit, but I do coach actors, and I did coach actors, and you were bringing something different. And I remember you did have a couple of pieces that you performed for me. If I recall, maybe something from Henry IV.
Yeah, exactly. Henry IV. It was "Do not think so, you shall not find it so."
Yeah. And I remember I thought, oh, a kid's good, and that's good. That makes my job easier. I can't remember what I charged at the time, but it was whatever the going rate was for coaching. But I remember at the end of the session saying to you, you might remember this differently. But what I remember was that I said, I'm not quite sure what to do with this, because I don't think you want me to teach you as an actor per se. It seems to me that what you're looking for is a mentor. And actually, I'm up for that, but I can't charge you for that. That's not something I can charge you for, but I can do it, but it'll be less structured. It'll be over time. It won't necessarily be sitting down like this with pieces of material, but it will happen.
Yeah, I actually, I remember it differently.
Okay, tell me.
So I went to pay you at the end, and you go, no. You don't have to pay me the first time, because, I have to charge for these things because it's my time. Like I like doing them. They're for fun, but you don't know what you're getting yourself into. So pay me next time.
Right. Okay.
And I was like, okay, great. And then the next day I got an email, and I'll read it to you because I remember it changed my life. He said, "Dear Michael, it was great talking with you today. I really admire your desire to learn and the fact that you are actively seeking out people to learn from. As you know, I charge a fee for coaching sessions. However, it seems to me that this is not what you're seeking. You're looking for mentorship, which cannot be sold, only given. It would be my privilege to mentor you. There will be no charge for our sessions. I look forward to working on your new pieces with you next Thursday. And that, I mean, I get emotional just reading it.
Yeah, I got emotional hearing you read it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my memory. Look, I guess one of the things we're going to find out about this is how, I was going to say fallible, but I don't mean fallible, how malleable memory is.
Yeah.
I had a version of that, but I didn't remember the exact details.
Yeah. And, you're going to see throughout this episode is that I don't do this now. Like now I'm 36 years old, but when I was a kid in my 20s, I saved emails from you, like, because I knew that they had emails. I was like, they have meaning for me, and I will go back to these things years from now. And so as I was preparing for this episode, I went back to all these emails that are I just saved them. I instinctively saved them. So anyway, Patrick and I, just to fast forward a little bit, I ended up going to my first season at Utah Shakespeare Festival, and I come back, and like he said, we begin to have an unstructured dialogue that when he was available, when I was available, when I was in town.
And I should say, Michael, that the Utah Shakespeare Festival, when you went there, what was the year you went there? 86 or
2006.
2006.
That was when you were there.
Right. I was there. Yeah, I was there in 86 and 87. No, you were there in 2006 and 2007, 20 years later. But my formative years as a classical actor were there. That's where I learned how to act Shakespeare. And I kind of, people ask me where my training comes from, and the only thing I can say is on the boards. But I was lucky enough to play many of Shakespeare's greatest roles on this magnificent replica of the Globe Theater, surrounded on three sides by the audience for the first hour in broad daylight, where you saw them and realized they were part of the experience. And I played a lot of characters at that time who spoke directly to the audience in soliloquy. And it really taught me about the need to connect with an audience, whether you can see them or not. And anyway, the point is that I had done 6 seasons there, and that's where you happen to go. So in terms of the coincidences and the kind of kismet of this thing, I just want people to understand that happened to be your first professional job per se.
Oh, and I hope you know, like, I don't think I ever told you this, but I was so proud to say I was like, I knew you. Like, I would say, oh, I know Patrick Page. And,
well, they put up those bar mitzvah pictures.
Yes. Well, in 1987, Richard III, you had this long lock of hair. I wish
it was my mullet.
It was so good. It was so good. And it was a formative place for me as well. It really it's huge, a testament to Fred Adams and the magic of what he created, and that Globe stage, I have to say, learning,
unique in the world.
Yeah, learning to do Shakespeare. Yeah, exactly. It was the only replica outside of London, if I
the one that Sam Wanamaker was trying to get to happen in London hadn't been built yet. So it was the most accurate Elizabethan theater in the world at that time.
Yeah, it's a magical place. And so I came back, and it was when we were in town, we would have conversations. And then I ultimately went to go do a Fulbright in Mongolia, where I investigated the relationship between ritual and performance, and studied shamanism and how that would relate to an actor, and belief systems. And I always remembered that your brother had done a Fulbright, and we had that connection as well, you know. Right. What was your brother's Fulbright on?
My goodness, I should know it. He's done a couple of them over the years.
It's wild.
My brother is most interested in the history of the Catholic Church, and so most of it's in that regard. I'm not quite sure. I should know. I'll call him tonight.
And I remember this really particular moment. So this actually, I think this will be interesting because it dovetails quite interestingly when I feel like our friendship took to a new level. Because I remember a really dark, sad time when I was in Mongolia. And I remember talking to you on the phone, and Um, and I brought you back this gift, which is the word nayats in old Mongolian script, which is the word friend, because it was that moment, and it was only later that I connected because I had no idea about your depression at all. Um, that there was this recognition of that type of feeling of loneliness, and you were
You
a
mean
huge comfort for me.
you felt it when you were in Mongolia?
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
and that's one of the distinctions that I really try to make for people about depression. My particular depression occurs usually when things are very, very, very good. So, for example, right now, when the world is in a crisis, I'm not having a depression. My depressions tend to hit me, and uh, I had a terrible one during that Grinch. I had a terrible one during that Man for All Seasons. They happen when everything is right. So I was working with a man who'd been my hero since I was a child, Frank Langella. I was playing a leading role on Broadway. I was getting lots of acclaim, and wham, it hit me.
Mm.
There's something in my unconscious mind that says, oh no, you mustn't succeed. You mustn't do that. That's not somehow fair to others who are not succeeding. That's somehow not fair to the rest of your family or friends, or I don't know. I can't. I've been in therapy for, oh my goodness, I don't know, over 30 years, but I still
Mm.
can't untangle why these things happen. Nevertheless, uh, to distinguish between depression, which is an insanity, and sadness or grief, which is the healthy um, reaction, for example, to loneliness. So you were
Mm.
literally at the end of the world, and
Hmm.
you were lonely, and it is quite right and natural to be sad and lonely at that time.
Exactly.
Um, and it's I wish we had a different word for it, because people will say I'm depressed because I got a D on my test. Well, no, it's right to feel sad if you get a D on your test. What's wrong is if you get an A on your test and you still feel like you want to kill yourself. That's
Mm.
depression.
You were the first person to really distinguish that for me because you gave me that understanding, the difference between what is depression and what is sadness. And I remember I really started to, well, I remember this is such a funny memory. I came back from that experience living in Mongolia, and the first thing I saw was Man for All Seasons. I remember I came to see the
I
show.
remember you flew in, and I was
Yeah,
afraid that you were going to fall asleep during the show because you'd been on a plane for 17 hours or something.
yeah, no,
And I thought
and it actually,
he's never going to be able to appreciate this. You came straight, if I recall, you came straight from the airport to the theater.
yeah, and this becomes a theme in our lives that wherever I'm traveling on some big adventure, the first thing I do is fly back and see you in a show somewhere. Um, and so I remember I saw Man for All Seasons, uh, and it was a, yeah, it was a big deal. It was a big deal to see you do that and to work with Frank Langella, and it was a big moment. And I that was end of 2008, and so it comes into this really interesting moment now with Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what's so interesting. So I had now been working at Telsey for a long time, and I was the main reader for
I
Spider-Man: Turn
just
Off
want
the
to
Dark.
catch people up. When you say you're
Yeah,
working at
yeah,
Telsey, Telsey is a major casting office in New York City, Bernard Telsey and Associates. And they were the casting directors of Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark. And Michael worked for them as a reader.
yeah. And so now this is, so I came back from Mongolia in the winter of 2008. So around like December 2008. And the casting for Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark started in spring of 2009. Um, and I got this email from you. And if it's okay, I'll read it because I think it will, I don't know, I learned so much from this, and it will.
Please, I'm. If I come off as well as I did in that last email, I'm all for it.
This is actually a moment. It will, you'll understand where it's coming from. um, because this is the first time you had ever admitted to me that um, you were struggling. Because actually, we should get the reader up to speed. You were currently, let's go there. So you were currently doing Claudius in, if I remember, Theater for a New Audience.
So yes,
Um,
I what had happened is while I was doing A Man for All Seasons, Theater for a New Audience asked if I would come in and read for David S. Bjornson, who was directing a new production of Hamlet with Christian Camargo in the lead. And I was interested in playing Claudius, and we went in and they cast me as Claudius, so that when Man for All Seasons closed, I went on. It was my lifelong dream to play a major Shakespearean role at a major theater in New York City. And it was this, I think, a kind of a strange thing in my life that it was, what was the year, Michael?
2009.
2009. So I had moved to New York in 1993. And in spite of the fact that in the rest of the country, I played most of Shakespeare's leading roles, I had never played a leading Shakespeare part in New York City. And I was about to get to do it. And so I was in rehearsal for that show when all of this went down.
And so I got this email on March 8th, 2009, and it said, "Dear Michael, sorry about bailing on you so suddenly last week. The truth is, I've had a major recurrence of depression, which is exhibiting as panic and anxiety. I've been crying, panicking, and non-functional for about 2 weeks. I have feelings of being strangled and pulled apart from the inside. Most of all, I have obsessive thinking about all these things. I've had to be replaced in Hamlet, which has been a tremendous relief, and now I can concentrate on healing until I go to San Diego in April, if I'm well enough. I've been also detoxing from massive amounts of painkillers I've been on for the past 12 years, but at a dangerous levels for the past 3, I think. I've had a lot of irrational obsessive thinking, which I'm now beginning to address. I've been placed on new antidepressant and anxiety meds. Paige has been amazing, is helping me to differentiate between my healthy thoughts and the lies my illness tells me. She's really been through hell for the past 3 years with this. She will be gone to LA this week for meetings which could not be changed, so I will mostly be by myself. Your gifts from Mongolia have been a comfort to me and are important in my life. I need you as my friend this week if you have any time. I'd love just to hang out and talk, and I'd love to work on your pieces and run Cyrano lines. I'm staying close to home, except when I'm at my doctor's. My attacks can come on suddenly, and I'm afraid of having them in public. I had a very public breakdown in Hamlet rehearsal, which turns out to have been a godsend because it got me help. When I begin to feel the onset of panic now, I try to give over to my angels and invisible guides. They have brought me so far and care for me so lovingly. But I also have visible guides, and I believe you are one of them. I do not want to be a burden, and I know you have many responsibilities and things you're dealing with yourself, but I would love to see you if you have a bit of time. Love, Patrick."
Mm. Yeah, that really
And
moves me to hear that
me
now.
too. It's that was the first time. It must have been really hard for you to read that letter or to write that letter to someone.
It was. I think it's hard for a lot of people with depression, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, to reach out for help because we think of the illness as behavioral as opposed to physical. And we think that we ought to be able to alter our behavior simply with our will, and we can't. And I fought medication, antidepressant medication, for 25 years. I'd had doctors for 25 years tell me that I needed to be medicated. And I always felt that I couldn't medicate myself because as an actor, I needed full access to all of my emotions. And I felt that if I were to medicate myself, I would lose that ability. We'll talk more about that and about medication and everything as we go on. But the fact of the matter is, during that time, my wife, Paige Davis, and my doctors, Kent Robert Shaw and Elma Lynch Canefield, convinced me that I did need medication, and they sent me on the road to being able to be healthy again. When I reached out to you, I remember that my therapist Elma had told me that I needed to dispose of all my pills. My doctor, Kent Robertshaw, had been helping me to wean myself off them. I was on a ridiculous amount of opiates that and I'm not proud of this at all, but in those days it was pretty easy to get them illegally through the internet. I don't know that it's that easy anymore, but in those days it was. You could set up accounts in 4, 5, 6 different places, and they would just come in the mail, and that's what I did. And when I finally owned up to that with my psychopharmacologist and told him everything I had been doing, he was like, "You're very lucky to be alive. Those are Heath Ledger levels." And so he and Paige and Elma helped me. You can't go cold turkey on something like that. You'll kill yourself. You need help to wean yourself from that kind of medication. And I was down about to the bottom, and I had weaned myself pretty much, I think, when I wrote that email. And my therapist, Elma Canefield, had told me that I needed to actually remove all the medication from my apartment. And that terrified me. And basically she was saying, "You got to flush the pills." And I was like, I don't know if I'm at the same point chronologically in the story you are, but I was like, I can't do that by myself. And Paige is out of town. And so I need help. And as I recall, you came over and we just kind of created a little ritual, because both of us are big believers in ritual. I think one of the tragedies of modern life is we have abandoned the old rituals because we have found them to be non-factual. But the fact that they're non-factual doesn't mean that they were no longer useful. So you may no longer believe, for example, let's say I grew up Catholic, and perhaps I no longer believe in the actual transubstantiation of Jesus's body into bread and wine, which my older brother believes in. But I mourn the loss of the ritual that I used to have every Sunday. I mourn the loss of the Mass. The Mass was important. So we created our own little ritual, and we said our own little words over the pills, as I recall. I hope you'll help me remember. And we flushed them down the toilet. And then I had a couple little tins that I carried with me. One was a tin about the size of a silver dollar, and I kept my pills in that. And I had another little square box, and I remember dropping both of those down the chute at my apartment was in some ways more difficult for me than flushing the pills down the toilet, because I knew where I could get more pills. But those little boxes had been my lifeline. That's where I kept my pills. And when I threw those down the chute with you, I knew that it was really over, that I was committed to it being over. And whenever you're committing to something new, it's terrifying. So I was scared, and I was so grateful to have you there. What's your memory of that?
It's exactly that. I came over. It reminds me of that Goethe quote that you began with,
exactly.
the beginning. And I remember sitting with you. I remember doing the ritual. I remember the image of the pills going down the toilet. I remember those tins. I'll never forget them. They're etched in my memory.
And this is a real good example for people. How old are you now? You're 37?
36, yeah.
36, and I'm 50. I'll be 58 in April. And I think that we were talking earlier about mentorship, and I think it's people have a kind of common understanding that in a mentorship, the person who's apprenticing themselves to the mentor obviously is seeking some kind of benefit from that. But what's less well known is how much the apprentice helps the mentor. And in this case, of course, you were indispensable to me. I could not have gotten through that moment without you there.
Yeah, it was a it's like it was a turning point, I think, in our relationship and our friendship, and in that mentorship apprentice standpoint of really becoming to another level. And it was at that same couch, we were sitting on your couch, and you go, so I have to go in for this Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. But and at the time they weren't releasing the script. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I'm your reader. And we said, well, okay.
I'm going to see right now if I can pull up an email from my sent, because I never delete anything. So we'll see if it's here. Because I remember writing my agency at the time and telling them they had written me so many times about Spider-Man over the years. Oh, now you're hearing the dings from my email. I had written them so many times. They had asked me in 2 or 3 labs or workshops if I would come in and audition for the role of the Green Goblin in Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, because I'd worked with Julie Taymor on The Lion King, and she knew me, I knew her, we worked well together, and I think she thought, that it might be a good part for me in those labs and workshops. Every time they called, I was in the middle of a depression, and every time I made some excuse not to go in. And finally, the final time, 2009 or 10, they wrote, and I was recuperating from the breakdown I had had during Hamlet. And they said, these are the final callbacks. Would you please come in? Julie would really like to see you. And you can't sing anything from your book. They need a rock song. I didn't have any rock song or even the slightest ability or inclination to find one. I was exhausted. And I'd had a big mental breakdown, and Paige said, I've got to get him out of town. So she took me out to our friend's house in the Hamptons. It was winter, thinking that might help to get me away from the noise and the crowded city. But when we got out there, it didn't help. We got trapped in a snowstorm, and I was laying in bed. And as I was laying in bed, freaking out, panicking, having anxiety attacks, this song came into my head from my childhood, Welcome to My Nightmare by Alice Cooper. And I suppose, I don't know why it came into my head. I always loved things that were macabre and gothic. And so I wasn't into rock music when I was a kid, but I was into monsters, and Alice Cooper was a monster. And so I knew this one song, Welcome to My Nightmare. I think you're going to like it. Welcome to My Nightmare, et cetera, et cetera. I thought maybe I can sing that song. So I started to listen to it over and over, and I listened to it for about a week, and we got back, and I knew, because you had told me that you were going to be the reader, that was some consolation. I was able to get up out of bed and go and get into the room at Telsey Studios and do this audition. I was not healthy. I was very, very, very ill at the time, but in a strange way, my illness was helpful, because Norman Osborn was a man who was going through a psychological break. And I was somebody who was going through a psychological break. Well, you can't do that 8 times a week, but for a 5-minute audition, it can work okay. So I sang that song, and I did the scene with you, and I'll let you take the memory from there.
Yeah. And the thing to note, well, we'll talk about this in a moment, but so we couldn't practice the scene at all, but they were like, you came into the room, and they're like, oh, of course, Julie treated you like an old friend because you are an old friend. And they were like, and this is Michael. And he's like, and you're like, I know Michael. And we did the scene where it's the the second scene. We did the first scene, which is really, I'm just kind of throwing lines in, which is when you first are the first scene in the show when you're in your lab
as Dr. Osborne.
Yeah, as Dr. Osborne, and then the second scene is when you're the Green Goblin, and you're the encounter with Peter Parker, and there's this amazing moment where, man, you just like committed. I mean, you just committed 100%, and you literally, and people, this is something you don't do in auditions, but in that moment, it was, you just came up and you literally grabbed me out of my chair, and everyone just started laughing because they knew it felt alive and scary. And we'll talk more about this on the audition podcast because
the Goblin's standing on the edge of the building and he wants Peter to look over it. So there was no way I could truthfully say, look down there. So I kind of took you by the back of the neck, as I recall, and made you look down over the edge of this imaginary building. And I was so grateful that I had a friend there. I really doubt I would have done that with anyone who I didn't know.
Yeah, it was with great power comes great, and you're like, power. But that was the moment, and then you walked out, and literally Julie turned to Glenn, Glenn's the writer. What's his name? Glenn Berger. She goes, well, we have to start writing a song that's like that Welcome to My Nightmare song. And unbeknownst to anyone perhaps on this listening to this was 2009, and Alan Cumming was actually cast in the role, and they were looking for potential other people, but
we didn't know that. I didn't know that when I came in, or
no,
I wouldn't
not
have
at
come
all.
in.
Yeah, and then but Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark ended up getting delayed.
What happened was that they called me after the audition, or my agent did, and said, everyone in the room really loved your work. But Alan's made this movie with Julie, and Alan wants to do it, and it's going to be Alan's part. And I was like, okay, whatever. At that time, I was trying to get well enough. My main worry on my plate at that time was I was scheduled to play Cyrano de Bergerac for Darko Treshnik at the Old Globe. And I was very worried about not being able to do it. So that was the only thing on my horizon that I cared about was Cyrano. I was just trying to get well enough to go do Cyrano de Bergerac. So whatever, Alan Cumming's going to play the Green Goblin. Fine, I'll go play Cyrano.
And you played Cyrano, and I actually got to see it because I was doing my third season at Utah Shakespeare Festival, and I remember I drove on my day off like 6-8 hours to go see your Cyrano, and it was one of the most magical performances I've ever seen. And that was summer of 2009, and fast forward a year into spring of 2010, I get a call from you, and you're about to go play the Madness. You're going to do the Madness of King George, and you're going to play also in King Lear as the Fool. And you said, hey, do you have 30 minutes? I need your advice. I just got Spider-Man, and maybe you can take it from there.
Oh, well, it's an interesting thing that happened. What was the date on that email?
That was an email. You called me on the phone. It was spring. It was the day you were literally leaving that weekend to go for. This was a long contract. That's a 6-month contract, or at least. And
I remember that we were packing. Paige and I were packing. She was in the bedroom, literally zipping up the suitcases to fly the next morning to San Diego. I had fully memorized, and not just memorized, that sounds so small, but I'd worked a year on the role of George in The Madness of King George.
We worked on it a lot together, in fact.
We worked on it a lot together. I felt very, very close to him because obviously I have a mental illness and he had a mental illness. It was King George III, who was king when a lot of our listeners probably know him from Hamilton when he sings You'll Be Back. But of course, it's a real man who's not a cartoon character and who suffered very greatly from an undiagnosed mental condition while he was king. And it's a beautiful play, and I was looking forward to doing it. It was going to be directed by one of the world's great directors, Adrian Noble. So I put all my eggs in that basket, and it's a Friday night, and I get this phone call from my agent's office. It was Josh Poltz, who's now my manager, who said, Patrick, are you someplace where we can talk for a minute? And I said, yeah. And he said, I'm going to make your weekend a little difficult. I said, okay. I thought, oh, am I fired from the old Globe? What's the matter? He said, you got an offer to play the Green Goblin in Spider-Man. And I said, I'm really sure you're wrong, because I did that audition a year ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't heard from them since. I mean, I understand if they want another meeting or want a callback or want another audition, but I'm sure I don't have an offer. And he said, no, you have an offer. We've been working on the deal. Actually, we have the deal. He told me the money. He told me the billing. He told me everything. It was a done deal. He said, you have to decide whether or not you want it. And I don't even think he put it in those terms. His assumption was that I was going to take it.
I remember you said that. Yeah, you said that their assumption was you're taking this, and you were like, "Give me some time. I need to think about this."
For me, it was a much harder question. I really, really, really didn't like the idea of abandoning the people in San Diego. I really, really, really wanted to play King George. My heart was in it 100%. And I said, you got to give me some time. They said, you can have an hour.
I remember.
And we'll talk about that, I guess, on a
Yeah,
future
we'll talk.
episode.
That will be a whole episode dedicated to Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark. But
people know what I chose,
yes,
and we'll get back to that later on.
And so you end up choosing Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark. I end up going to start an NGO in the world's largest refugee camp in Dadaab.
What is an NGO?
A non-government organization, so like a nonprofit. And so I, for a year, go to live on the border of Somalia and northeast Kenya, and it was on the verge of a humanitarian crisis, and it became a humanitarian crisis while I was there, where the refugee camp went from 250,000 refugees to 500,000 in the span of time I was there. And it was there that I began writing Patrick a letter once a week, and he was playing the Green Goblin at the time. He was going through his own crisis, which we'll talk more about. As everyone knows, the play had a lot of unforeseen circumstances that I'll say came about.
Some unforeseen and some foreseeable.
Yes. And I think we'll lead the listener. We'll tell that whole story when we go back to Spider-Man, and we'll do a whole episode on that. But Patrick helped me formulate a question, which was, is theater essential as food and water and love?
It must have been so, Michael, I just can't imagine what you went through when you're seeing the kind of suffering you saw in Somalia. It must rock you to the core about your decisions in life as to whether or not being an actor, being a storyteller, has any utility whatsoever. I mean, I think a lot of people are going through that now with the virus. It's like, what am I doing? Making Instagram videos and podcasts when nurses are doing 24-hour shifts. Mm-hmm. How useless am I? Mm-hmm. And yet, when those nurses go home, the first thing they want to do is turn on Netflix and watch a story played out. An important story, a meaningful story, a story that has some depth, maybe a story that just diverts and entertains them for a while. But story is so important. And I think it's so extraordinary that, having seen what you've seen in Mongolia and Somalia, all over the world, that you keep coming back to storytelling as your vocation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's something I think, I tell my students all the time is like, your work will not matter unless it matters deeply to you. And working with individuals that felt like they had no hope, and when they started to identify and to tell their story that is individual to them, and this will seed more into what we talk about with the Patrick Page Studio, they became alive, and their work mattered, and they mattered.
So the extraordinary thing to me is that you are in a refugee camp in Somalia. It's a humanitarian crisis. The refugees have doubled during the time you're there, from 250,000 to 500,000 refugees. And the thing that blows my mind is that you still feel, having seen all you've seen, that it is an essential thing to be a storyteller, to be an artist, to have a voice. And you actually worked with refugees in that way.
Yeah, and it was as if they would come alive. They would stand up. They would literally. I remember I worked with a young man named Ojulu Opio Chan, who, when he first started working with me, could barely speak above a whisper. But by the end, he was shouting poetry at the
Oh
top
my
of his
gosh.
lungs.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
and I remember his first performance. He literally danced across the desert. That's literally what it was like. And he he took his bow and he said, "My name is Ajulu Opio Chan. My mother does not know her ABCs, but here I stand before you."
Oh my
You know?
gosh.
And
Oh my
it's
gosh.
those. Granted, I came back from New York, and of course, as always the tradition, I came back and I saw Spider-Man turn off the dart
You got
that
right
night.
back.
But I of course I struggled that whole year I was back of what does it mean to be commercial in this art form. I go back to the first email you sent me, which the mentorship cannot be sold; it can only be given. And there was a lot of uh, dialogue in myself of what does it mean to work in commercial theater
Hmm.
after I had just had this huge experience, and that's something I question still to this day. But funnily enough, I went from that experience and I ended up working in with my theater company, Theater Me Too, in Juarez, Mexico, during the height of the drug war. We worked on a piece called Juarez, a documentary
I
mythology.
saw that piece. It was wonderful.
Yeah, and it was something that we were looking at, that the stories that people tell about themselves or their city is what keeps them alive. And I think about that in this current moment and why we need storytellers, why it matters that you're putting your material on YouTube or you're writing a new book or you're working on, I know you're working on your show, All the Devils Are Here. It matters because number one, it matters to you. But number two, that is the mythology. What chronicles the time. It's what chronicles the moment. It's the reflective nature of why we do what we do. And this is why stories matter more, in my opinion, than anything in this moment. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah.
stories are theater, stories, television, film, novels, poetry, music, even. These are the underpinnings. Science is about things, about the world of things, of tangible things. But then there's a world of action, the world in which we have to choose between, we always have to make a choice between one action or another action. Do I go this way or do I go that way? Do I stay where I am or do I move towards something else? And that's what every story is about what's the right thing to do in this situation. That's what our dreams are about.
Hmm.
It's funny, this week on Facebook I asked my Facebook friends a question. I said, what's the earliest dream you remember?
Hmm.
And many people answered. And what's interesting is that every single one of their dreams, I asked because my earliest dream that I recall was I was in the white van that my parents owned. I was 3 or 4 years old. And somehow we were going through hilly, treacherous, precipitous mountain range with steep drop offs and no guardrails. And somehow my parents weren't there or they were incapacitated. And so I had to drive the van, but my feet couldn't reach the brakes and my eyes couldn't see over the dashboard. I wasn't up to the task. I think that's the way so many of us are feeling now.
Hmm.
And in the middle of this virus. And when I asked that question of my Facebook friends, every single person, with maybe one or two exceptions, had dreams that we would maybe call nightmares. They were all dreams about loss of control and trying to regain control, about running from something, about trying to control a situation. And that's what a lot of our stories are. That's what Hamlet's about. Hamlet is about, at the beginning of any story is the introduction of chaos, and then the person trying to restore order. That's what every story is about.
Yeah.
And
Order, disorder, reorder. So
that's right. And so artists are kind of the high priests that guide you through that territory. Um, at our best. Of
yeah,
course,
yeah.
we're also clowns and buffoons and fools. And
Yeah, I remember working with the Grotowski company. They used to say, like, who are you to think that you're more educated than the spectator? You know, it's like in at our best, um, we are, like I always say to, I've been really discovering this a lot lately. You befriend the unknown.
that's
And as
right.
you befriend the unknown, these invisible guides, we'll go back to talking more about this throughout our whole time, is the reason I went to Mongolia is partly because I was inspired by this book called Between Worlds. And the last quote of the book I always found was so beautiful. It says, "To live between worlds is to know truth and beauty, even as if they all told me it leaves you helplessly lonely."
Yes.
Which is, you always understood this. Like, this is something that we've been talking about for years, you know?
Well, it's so important to me that art, that theater embraces mystery, embraces ambiguity, embraces the complexity of life, which is never black or white. And it's why my guide is Shakespeare. You can read a play about war, for example, Henry V, and I defy you to tell me after you've read that play whether Shakespeare was a Republican or a Democrat, a conservative or a liberal. We're so small-minded now when we cancel people based on a competing ideology. We're in this together. Somebody can disagree with you ideologically, but, you know, as Shylock points out, right? They still bleed when you prick them. They still laugh when you tickle them. They're cured by the same means, healed by the same, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer. And I think when theater gets overly political, overly topical, it becomes small. That the embracing of mystery, the embracing of ambiguity, the embracing of complexity is what's always drawn me to the arts. I certainly don't blame anyone who is drawn in a different way, but I like to enter a play with exactly what you've just said, with an assumption that the audience is just as smart as me and that I'm not there to teach them. That is repellent to me, the idea that I'm there to teach the audience, but that I'm there to explore the questions of what it means to be human with them, together on an equal footing. I'm not above. I don't have the answers. We're going to explore this together. I believe that's why Shakespeare is the greatest playwright who ever lived, because that's where he came from. I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who writes a play with an agenda which has an outcome that they would like me to complete. They'd like to change me in this way. I'm all for theater. It's a beautiful, beautiful story about your friend dancing and jumping and shouting in Africa. He was changed in a glorious way, but he wasn't changed toward a particular ideology or way of looking at the world. It was that his humanity was affirmed. That's what made it a great moment.
Yeah, and what's so beautiful, and as I come back from Africa, and then you finally played the Guiche in Cyrano, and you continue to work, you continue to do Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark, and your career continues. What continues for us, at least, are these conversations around Shakespeare, and I ended up going to play Ariel in The Tempest. You end up later going to play Prospero in The Tempest, and these conversations, they become this marker. I can only speak for myself, and I know you feel the same way. Every conversation we have, every time we hang out, we're always somehow talking about Shakespeare in some form, because it's It's the guide. And there's this email actually you sent me, which again, how you said it is so, it's so, again, it's an email that I saved because I couldn't figure out a better way to say it. You said the longing to be good, to be great, to be an artist, to leave behind something lasting, if only emblazoned on the memories of a few, is something we share. It's an existential hunger, a longing, an ache more akin to a heartbeat than a wound. Like hunger, we seek to relieve it only to have it replaced again and again. Like a heartbeat, it lets us know we are alive and in communion with something much greater than ourselves. The craving, I suppose, is for mastery. Desire to become a magus as Prospero was, to be able to control the thunder, wind, and rain of our invisible inner world. My observation of the years is that few actors have this longing. They crave something else, affection, attention, affirmation. I've also noticed that some of the greatest artists I know, Burkhoff and Langella to name two, never really lose that craving, but they transcend it and mold it into a passion for craft. Maybe because the longing for affirmation hurts too much, whereas the longing of mastery of craft leads to a tantalizing, lifelong process of discovery. In your case and in mine, it also led to the discovery of Shakespeare, in which all questions are posed and all answers, such as they are to be found. No one has ever been closer to understanding the invisible or channeling the divine. So we study, we learn, we study again, we act in the plays, we read them, we learn how to read them better. We grow to know him. Not a bad way to spend a life.
Hmm.
Do you
That
remember
sounds
writing
like,
that?
I don't, Michael, but it
Oh,
seems like a good place to wrap this up. And then maybe next time to talk about acting itself and the creating of our acting studio. And really, you were the catalyst for that. I had
yeah.
resisted creating my own studio for years. Michael kept asking me to teach more people and to make it and to do it in a more structured way. I resisted because it was work. People don't like to do work. I don't like to do work. I'd rather write beautiful, poetic emails. Um, I don't want to actually get out there and do any work. But Michael said, we got to do this. And so next time, why don't we talk about that and talk about some of the principles in the foundation of the studio? Just to give you a little heads up, I didn't want to, I thought there were a lot of acting teachers. I thought there were a lot of acting books. I actually think there are way too many acting schools. And in some ways, I think it's a bit of a racket because there are way, way, way more schools charging people a lot of money to become actors than there are jobs for those actors. And so I went into it with a kind of ethical dilemma about whether or not it was a good thing to do. And it was only when I realized that over several decades, I had in fact developed a technique that worked for me, that was unique, based on all of the principles of Western acting, but which brought them together in a different way and um, allowed me to approach a script relatively fearlessly because I felt I knew what I was doing when I would pick up a piece of text. And I wanted to give other people that feeling of what you say, the word of mastery. Now, Sanford Meisner said, it takes about 20 years to learn how to be an actor, to learn to act. I think that's probably pretty accurate in my own case. You can teach somebody how to act in about 48 hours or less, but it takes about 20 years to learn how to act. There's a big distinction between knowing how to do something and being able to do it.
Yeah.
It's taken me at least that long. And of course, it's still always, always, always an uphill battle. One is never happy with one's own work. I've never talked to an actor, no matter how gifted or how experienced, who was happy with his or her own work. But we did come up with something that I think has been very helpful for people and very useful. The feedback we get is kind of phenomenal. So why don't we talk about that next time?
Yeah, we'll look forward to it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon. Hey everyone, if you haven't yet, make sure you rate and review the podcast and share with us any questions you may have or topics you would like for us to cover on a future episode. If you're interested in training with us, send an email to patrickpagestudio@gmail.com and we'll add you to our email list. Hope you have a great day.